G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Okay, so we're into session 13 of the book of Ezekiel. We're looking at chapter 19, verse 1, right down to chapter 20, verse 32. That is our hope. We will get through that tonight. Now, we see in chapter 19, verses 1 to 14, we see the lamentation over the princes of Israel. This is the last prophecy in this third series of prophecies, which began back in chapter 12, verse 1. And this one here comprises the whole of chapter 19, and it's a lamentation over the princes of Israel. Verses 1 to 2 are the introduction to another allegorical story. Moreover, this is verse 1 and 2. Moreover, take you up a lamentation for the princes of Israel, and say, what was your mother? A lioness? She couched among lions. In the midst of the young lions, she nourished her whelps. So in verse 1, we see here Ezekiel is now asked to take up a lamentation. The phrase means to take up a dirge, if you like. The first line of this verse more or less serves as a title for the whole chapter. And the object of this dirge or the lamentation is the princes of Israel, which are the kings of Judah. Now in verse 2, he tells us he's going to tell this story through the figure of a lioness or a mother lion and her whelps or baby lions. He actually uses two different figures in this chapter. This one is a lioness we're going to look at here. And then this is 3 to 9. And then he'll use another figure beginning in verse 10. Now the lioness figure here represents the kingdom of Judah with its capital in Jerusalem. And here the lioness is couched among lions. This refers, the lions here refers to other nations among whom she nourished her whelps, her baby cubs. Now, the young lions that we see here are the rulers of these nations. She, Judah, had lain among lions, that is, she corrupted herself with the idolatry of the surrounding nations and had brought up the royal young ones in the same manner, in the same vein, in the corruption of idolatry. And then in verses 3 to 4, the story is about her first cub who becomes king. Now this one represents King Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz we see in verses 3 to 4. And she brought up one of her whelps. He became a young lion and he learned to catch the prey. He devoured men. The nations also heard of him. He was taken in their pit, and they brought him with hooks onto the land of Egypt. Now, first lion cub who later became a young lion was named Shallum, and he was later renamed Jehoahaz. And he took the throne of Jerusalem at the age of 23. He learned to catch prey. He devoured men, which means that he was a wicked king. But in verse 4, his fall eventually came about when he was captured and taken down into Egypt. Pharaoh took him off the throne and took him into captivity. And the historical background to these events is in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 30 to 34, and 2 Chronicles 36, 1 to 4, and also Jeremiah chapter 22, verses 10 to 12 tells us the story of Jehoahaz. The hooks are probably to be taken literally here. They were actually used to lead captive into exile. And you can see that in Ezekiel 29:4, Ezekiel 38:4, and Isaiah 37:29. Ezekiel 29:4, 38:4, and Isaiah 37:29. An Assyrian king boasts of how he treated a captive vassal. He says, I pierced his cheeks with a sharp-edged spear. I put the ring to his jaw, placed a dog collar around his neck. So there you go. It was in vogue way back then. Now, then comes the next young cub that becomes a young lion. This time it is Jehoiachin or Jehoiachin. And this is in verses 5 to 9. Now, when she saw that she had waited and her hope was lost, then she took another of her whelps and made him a young lion. And he went up and down among the lions. He became a young lion, and he learned to catch the prey. He devoured men. And he knew their palaces and laid waste their cities. The land was desolate, and the fullness thereof, because of the noise of his roaring. Then the nations set against him on every side from the provinces, and they spread their net over him. He was taken in their pit, and they put him in a cage with hooks and brought him to the king of Babylon. They brought him into strongholds, that his voice should no more be heard upon the mountains of Israel. So eventually, Jehoiakim now takes the throne. His appointment came in verse 5. It says, when she saw that she had waited and her hope was lost. Now, what's this about? Well, the lost hope here refers to the expectation that Jehoahaz would be released from Egypt to retake his throne. But it became obvious in time that he was going to remain a prisoner in Egypt for the rest of his life. So he was down there, so they had to produce a new king, Jehoiakim. So Jehoahaz, would never again sit upon David's throne. And since that hope had been dashed, she took another of her whelps and made him a young lion. Now Jehoiakim took the throne at the age of 18, and he ruled a whole 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem. That's all. But in that short time, he was able to do evil in the eyes of Jehovah, just as his father had done. Now, Jeremiah's word, this is Jeremiah's words against him in Jeremiah 22, give an indication of the destruction that would come upon him, even suggesting that he ought to be recorded as having no children, because none of his children would ever sit on the throne of David. That's Jeremiah 22, verses 28 to 30. Remember, this is Jehoiakim or Jeconiah, who had the curse placed upon him. Now, in verse 6, we have a description of his power. He went up and down among the lions. He became a young lion, and he learned to catch prey. He devoured men. So what he did was he imitated the tyranny of surrounding kings and turned out to be as wicked as the previous king of Judah. In verse 7, his sin was in using his power to despoil his own people and land. It says he knew their palaces. Actually, the Hebrew actually reads, he knew their widows. The implication of this literal reading is that this man, Jehoiakim, is that this man killed their husbands and then he raped the widows. This is this man Jehoiakim. This is in the 3 months and 10 days that he ruled. He laid waste their cities, and the land was desolate, the fullness thereof, because of the noise of his roaring. So he not only decimated the nobility in the land, he also used his power throughout the land to despoil it. The terror was removed only when he was dethroned and then deported by Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 8 says, then the nations set against him on every side from the provinces, and they spread their net over him. He was taken in their pit. That was his capture. And it says they put him, in verse 9, they put him into, this is his captivity. They put him in a cage with hooks, and he brought him to the king of Babylon, and they brought him into strongholds, that his voice should no more be heard upon the mountains of Israel. But just like Jehoahaz, he too was eventually captured and taken into captivity in verse 9. Put him in a cage with hooks. Quite often, again, this could be referring to the hooks often passed through the nose of beasts, so to through that of captives, as we also see in some Assyrian sculptures, where we see this with those taken captive with hooks through their noses and cheeks. And it says he brought him into Babylon, the king of Babylon. Now, while the first prince was brought with hooks to the land of Egypt, back in chapter 19, verse 4, this second prince is brought with hooks and in a cage to the king of Babylon. So his voice was no more heard upon the mountains of Israel. The young lion was to roar in chains, but not on the mountains of Israel anymore. And the background to this section is found in 2 Kings 24, verses 6 to 16, and 2 Chronicles 36, verses 8 to 10. Now, Ezekiel now goes to the third lion cub, and this time it's going to be Zedekiah. Thy mother was like, this is in verses 10 to 14. Thy mother was like a vine in thy blood planted by waters. It was fruitful and full of branches by reason of many waters. And it had strong rods for the scepters of them that bear rule. And their stature was exalted among the thick boughs. And they were seen in their height with the multitude of their branches. But it was plucked up in fury. It was cast down to the ground, and the east wind dried up its fruit. Its strong rods were broken off and withered. The fire consumed them. And now it is planted in the wilderness in a dry and thirsty land. And fire is gone out of the rods of its branches. It hath devoured its fruit, so that there is in it no strong rod to be a scepter to rule. This is a lamentation, and shall be for a lamentation. So in verses 10 to 11 of chapter 19, Ezekiel now turns to the rule of Zedekiah. And remember, Zedekiah is the last king of Judah. Now, in place of the lioness of verse 2, he uses the figure of a vine and its rods or its branches. It says, thy mother was like a vine. The word thy here is referring to King Zedekiah, of course. And the figure of Judah as a vine is found as early as Genesis 49, verse 11. Genesis 49, 11. In thy blood here is a figure of speech which means to live in the life of her children. Now, as Ezekiel has already spelled out earlier in the prophecy concerning Zedekiah, he was planted by the waters. It was fruitful and full of branches by reason of many waters. So what does this mean? Well, it means that he was situated in Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar, who was a benevolent monarch. And there he could prosper as long as he obeyed Nebuchadnezzar. That's the clincher. He had to be obedient unto Nebuchadnezzar to be prosperous. Now, verse 11, in verse 11, this was also true for other rulers in the kingdom, princes of the royal house of David. They were the nobility who were still left in the land. They were the strong rods for the scepters. These were the ones who were, after the first and second deportations to Babylon, they were also set in circumstances where they could also prosper. The vine shot forth her branches like so many scepters, not creeping lowly on the ground like many vines, but actually trained aloft on a tree or a wall. And it says that their stature was exalted among the thick boughs. So it was a position of honor and influence. This is what the other strong rods were, the other nobility. Again, as long as they remained in submission to Babylon, as we saw earlier, they did indeed prosper. Then in verses 12 to 14, he now deals with the fall of Zedekiah. In verse 12, we have the fall of the king and his princes. But it, the vine, was plucked up in fury. It was cast down to the ground, and the east wind dried up its fruit. So this vine did not gradually wither away, but it was plucked up or uprooted suddenly. And the east wind here refers to Babylon, which is situated east of Judah. Strong rods were broken off and withered. The English text in most translations has rods in the plural, but the Hebrew text has the singular rod, which refers to Zedekiah in particular. So this one, the strong rod, Zedekiah, was broken off and withered. The vine forgot that God was her source of blessing. Therefore, God uprooted the nation, deporting her from the land. So when Babylon blew in, as it were, from the east, the nation shriveled under the heat of her oppression. His fall was now followed, this is Zedekiah's fall, was now followed in verse 13 by the captivity. They were now planted in the wilderness in a dry and thirsty land. Now, Chaldea, where they went into Babylonia, was well watered and fertile, but it is a condition of the captive people and not of the land, which is referred to here, where it says they were planted in the wilderness in a dry and thirsty land. So this luxuriant vine of the nation would be uprooted from her homeland and cast down on foreign soil. And then in verse 14, the kingdom itself now came down in destruction. Why was it destroyed? Well, in verse 14, because fire is gone out of the rod of its branches, it hath devoured its fruit. Now, what we see here is that the ultimate source of this fire was not Babylon. It was the vine itself. It was the rulers themselves that brought about their own destruction. Ezekiel makes the same point here as many of the prophets made, and also in the New Testament, Jesus also emphasized this many times over. That is, it was the responsibility of the rulers in leading the nation astray, and thereby it was because of the rulers that judgment was now brought upon the nation. Israel's rulers were always leading their nation astray. The specific incident under scrutiny here is Zedekiah's act of rebellion, which brought about the destruction of his kingdom. That is why, in the closing prophecy of this third series, it is in the form of a lamentation for the rulers. So that there is, and it goes on to say, so that there is in it no strong rod to be a scepter to rule. What that means is no more kings of David's stock are now to rule the nation, except for one, Messiah, when he comes. Now, the background to this segment is 2 Kings 24, verses 17 to 25, verse 7, and 2 Chronicles 36, verses 10 to 22. Now, the chapter ends here the way it began, by announcing that these words are for a lamentation. And this is because the rulers of Israel are the ones who are held primarily guilty for what is happening. And now, for the second time in Ezekiel's book, a short chapter of only 14 verses is now followed by a long chapter of 49 verses. Now, couple of eight things I want to look at here. Reasons or objections for the rejection of the true prophet. These are the reasons that we see in the book of Ezekiel. If judgment comes, they're saying it won't be in our lifetime. That was back in chapter 12, verses 1 to 28. Why believe the true prophets and not believe those that predict a short exile? These are the objections for rejecting the true prophets. That was back in chapters 13 and 14. Judgment should come on the leaders and not the people. That's chapter 14, 1 to 11. Any righteous person can intercede and the judgment will be reverted. What happened there was that they actually refused to recognize that they crossed a point of no return. And that was in the second half of chapter 14, verses 12 to 23. God will not judge his chosen people that severely. What happened to them was that they failed to recognize because they were the chosen people, and that is why he judges them more severely. And that was in chapters 15 and 16. In chapter 17, judgment for the sins of the fathers would not be fair to us. It wasn't our fault, it was our father's fault. And in chapter 18, if judgment is inevitable, repentance will be useless. And then in chapter 19, Zedekiah will find a way to defeat the enemy. These are all the reasons why they objected or for rejecting the true prophets. These are the ones that came up with anyway. Couple of other things which I didn't put a slide for you. A couple of seven reasons God gives for Judah's destruction. Chapter 12, verses 1 to 20. Judah failed to submit to God's discipline when, with the first two deportations, the people refused to submit to God and live according to his law. That's the first thing. Second, chapter 13 and 14, Judah rejected divine revelation by rejecting God's true prophets and accepting the words of the false prophets. Chapter 15, Judah failed to be faithful. These are the reasons for Judah's destruction. Chapter 16, Judah has a very long history of unfaithfulness. Chapter 17, Judah trusted in her political alliances like with Egypt, and they put their security in other nations rather than in the Lord their God. Chapter 18, Judah refused to take responsibility for their sin. And chapter 19, Judah was already spiritually dead. they'll also become politically dead. I'll send this to you after the class, after the session. Okay, we're looking at God's dealings with Israel in chapter 20, verse 1, right down to chapter 23, verse 49. Okay, this is the fourth and the last series of prophecies in this section, book of Ezekiel, which is chapters 20 to 24. This is dealing with God's dealings with Israel. And the first section is from verses 1 to 32 of chapter 20, in which we are now given a review of Israel's past. Came to pass in the seventh, this is verses 1 to 4, the date and occasion. And it came to pass in the 7th year, in the 5th month, the 10th day of the month, that certain of the elders of Israel came to inquire of Jehovah and sat before me. And the word of Jehovah came unto me, saying, Son of man, speak unto the elders of Israel, and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, Is it to inquire of me that you are come? As I live, saith the Lord Jehovah, I will not be inquired of by you. Wilt thou judge them, son of man? Wilt thou judge them? Cause them to know the abominations of their fathers. Okay. First up, the date is in the 7th year, which would make it 591 BC. 5th month is the month Av, which falls around July or August. And it was the 10th day of the month. So it was on the 10th day of Av, 591 BC. This means that 11 months have passed between chapter 8, verse 1 and chapter 20, verse 1. Now, this prophecy is the last in a series of prophecies before Jerusalem falls, when all Ezekiel's near prophecies will be fulfilled. And in this section of chapters 20 to 24, the key phrase is, Wilt thou judge? It's found in verse 4 of chapter 20, and again in 22 verse 2 and 23 verse 36. Wilt thou judge? Now, the occasion itself is given at the end of verse 1. Once again, we see the elders of Judah came, as they had back in chapter 8 verse 1 and chapter 14 verse 1, to inquire of Jehovah. Now, why had they come this time? Well, in the year 591 BC, the then Pharaoh, who was a guy called Psammetichus II, had recently won a great victory in the Sudan. And on the strength of that victory, he was considering marching into the land of Canaan to reclaim Egyptian sovereignty from the Babylonians. So Zedekiah began toying with the idea, which he later adopted, that he would use this opportunity to rebel against Babylon by joining with the Egyptians. Now, maybe one of the questions that the elders of Israel came with was, will Egypt triumph over Babylon as she has over the Sudan? It could have been that. The Bible doesn't tell us what it was. In other words, what they could have asked was, because of the times, will Egypt succeed, and will Zedekiah succeed later in setting us free from Babylon? That's the question. Now, in verse 2, the word of Jehovah comes, not to answer their specific question, but to now spell out their problem. So as the word of God comes in this final series of prophecies, which make up this segment, in chapter 20, God is going to look back over the entire past history of Israel, and he's going to show how throughout Jewish history, the rulers and the people had always consistently disobeyed him. And their present situation would prove to be exactly the same. It would be no different. And then in chapter 21, he's going to warn them to be prepared for the final judgment of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, and to expect more exiles to arrive from Jerusalem. Chapters 22 to 23, God will spell out some reasons why this last judgment was necessary. And then in chapter 24, he'll end with a parable and 2 signs to illustrate the things he's been talking about. So that is the flow of thought in these last 4 chapters of the second major division of the book of Ezekiel. All right, back to verse 3. So this is the rebuke to the elders. When God does speak now, he rebukes. It's a word of rebuke to the elders. The rebuke is it to inquire of me that you are come? And now God puts himself onto earth here. He says, as I live. That's putting himself onto earth. And he then decrees that he will not be inquired of by you. You're wasting your time coming down here, fellas. But instead, in verse 4, he passes judgment upon the elders by asking Ezekiel to voice his words of judgment. Will thou judge them, son of man? Now, he repeats it here to make it emphatic. It's repeated twice. And then at the end of verse 4, he gives us the theme of this entire section up to verse 29. Cause them to know the abominations of their fathers. And then he now is going to start to run through their history. We see the rebellion in Egypt in verses 5 to 9. We're going to read down to verses 5 to 7. Say unto them, thus says the Lord Jehovah, in the day when I chose Israel, and swear unto the seed of the house of Jacob, and made myself known unto them in the land of Egypt, when I swear unto them, saying, I am Jehovah your God, in that day I swear unto them to bring them forth out of the land of Egypt into a land that I had searched out for them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all lands. And I said unto them, cast ye away every man the abominations of his eyes, and defile not yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am Jehovah your God. So that's what he's saying here in verses 5 to 7. As God now deals with each of these historic events, he follows a specific pattern here. First of all, he starts out by showing what his provision was. And his provision here is in these verses 5 to 7. In verses 5 to 6, there was the election of Israel. In verse 5, God revealed himself through Moses. It says, in the day when I chose Israel. Now, positionally, Israel was chosen with Abraham. He's the father of the Jewish people. But experientially, they began to understand that they had been chosen by God with Moses. You know, the parallel passage is Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 to 11. God says, I swear unto the seed of the house of Jacob. This means that God lifted up his hand and is swearing or putting himself under oath on Israel's behalf is emphasized in this chapter. Not always on Israel's behalf, of course, but sometimes against Israel. In verses 5, 6, 15, 23, 28, and 42, that's 5, 6, 15, 23, 28, and 42, we find God taking an oath, either for or against Israel. God made himself known unto them in the land of Egypt by the name Jehovah. And the background to this is Exodus chapter 3, verses 13 to 18, and Exodus 6, verses 2 to 9. In verse 6, God made a promise that stated first, that he would bring them forth out of the land of Egypt, and second, that he would bring them into the land of Canaan. This was the land that God himself had specifically searched out for them. It was specially chosen by God as a land flowing with milk and honey, meaning that it was very productive. This was a unique land, which is the glory of all lands. Why? Because of God's special choosing of this land. Israel now had an obligation in verse 7, which was to repudiate all idolatry. God had asked them while still in Egypt to cast away every man the abomination of his eyes, and not to defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. Now, we know from other records that Israel was idolatrous in Egypt. We know this from Leviticus chapter 17, verse 7, and Joshua 24:14, also Ezekiel 23:3, and Amos chapter 5, verses 25 to 27. In fact, according to Amos, they even carried their idols with them throughout their wilderness wandering. So they had these little idols, these little teraphim with them right throughout their wilderness wanderings. So the first point made in each section, what we're going to be looking at in each of the sections, is God's provision. This is followed, secondly, by a statement of their rebellion. In the first part of verse 8, but they rebelled against me. And the evidence of their rebellion is in that they did not every man cast away the abomination of their eyes. In other words, they didn't actually forsake Egyptian idolatry. They continued on with it. And then thirdly, therefore, this was followed by divine judgment in the second part of verse 8. Then I said, I would pour out my wrath upon them to accomplish my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt. Now, Sinai was part of Egypt at this time. The fourth element in each section is when judgment is now followed by divine mercy. And we have this here in verse 9. Divine mercy is always based upon the preservation of God's name. He says, for my name's sake. So God did not carry out his divine judgment to the full because of his name's sake. And the reason is that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations, or so that the Gentile nations would not get the wrong impression that God simply brought the Jews out of Egypt for the purpose of wiping them out. You'll remember that this was the basis of some of Moses' own intercessions on Israel's behalf. Now, going back to the Mosaic Law, we'll find this situation in Exodus chapter 7, verse 5, Numbers 14, verses 15 to 16, and Deuteronomy 9, verse 28. So God's mercy was based on the fact that if the God of Israel had destroyed Israel totally, then the nations would have misinterpreted the situation. The same point is similar point is made in Psalm 106, verses 6 to 8. Now in verses 10 to 17, we see the rebellion in the wilderness. So I caused them to go forth out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. And I gave them my statutes and showed them mine ordinances, which if a man do, he shall live in them. Moreover, also I gave them my Sabbaths, to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am Jehovah that sanctifieth them. All right, so we'll just 10 to 12, verses 10 to 12. Now, same procedure is going to be followed here as in the previous section. First, we're going to have God's provision in verses 10 to 12, and involved in that provision, involved in that provision this time was first of all the Exodus in verse 10. I have brought them out of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. So this was the wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. Second, in verse 11, God gave them the law of Moses in statutes and ordinances. These are already spelled this out in chapter 18, which if a man do, God says, if you obey my ordinances, my commands, if a man do that, he shall live in them. The quotation here comes from Leviticus 18, verse 5, and this quotation is actually reaffirmed in Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 to 21, and 30, verses 15 to 20. Third thing we see is verse 12, God's provision was the sign of the Sabbath. Now, while not all covenants carried with them a physical or visible sign, some did. For example, the sign of the Noahic covenant was the rainbow. The sign of the Abrahamic covenant was circumcision. The sign of the Mosaic covenant is the Sabbath. And one of the reasons why only 9 and not all 10 of the 10 commandments are also part of the law of Christ in the New Testament is because the law of the Sabbath was not carried over into the New Testament. It's not a law in the New Testament. This is because the law of Moses is no longer in effect, and therefore the sign of it is no longer in effect. That is why there is no obligation for Christians to keep the Sabbath day. It is a sign of the Mosaic covenant. It's also a sign that God brought Israel out of Egypt. And that is why the Seventh-day Adventists have a problem here, because God never brought the Seventh-day Adventists out of Egypt. The purpose of the Sabbath and these other things here was that they might know that I am Jehovah that sanctifieth them. This is one of God's compound names, Jehovah their sanctifier. That's a better reading of it here, Jehovah their sanctifier. Another passage where the Sabbath is said to be a specific sign is Exodus chapter 31, verses 12 to 17. Now, following God's provision in the wilderness in verse 13, there was rebellion once again. But the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness, and the evidence of their rebellion is that they did not walk in accordance with the statutes and ordinances of the Mosaic law. And the background to this rebellion is recorded in Numbers 11 to 16. And also we see it in, I think that's the next section, isn't it? Hang on, let me quick check. Yeah, here it is. Okay. So the evidence here of their rebellion is that they did not walk in accordance with my statutes, rejected mine ordinances. Yeah, again, background is Numbers chapter 11 to chapter 16. And poetically, we read about this in Psalm 106, verses 13 to 27. Second part of verse 13 came divine judgment. Then I said I would pour out my wrath upon them in the wilderness. And the purpose of that was to consume them. But again, that was stayed by divine mercy in verses 14 to 17. In verse 14, we see again that God's mercy was based upon his concern to preserve the sanctity of his name. But I wrought for my name's sake, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations in whose sight I brought them out. And the background to this is Numbers 14, verses 11 to 19, and Deuteronomy 1, verses 26 to 33. However, although God would not pour out the full extent of his divine judgment, yet we see in verse 15, there was divine discipline. Moreover, also, I swear unto them in the wilderness that I would not bring them into the land which I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, which is the glory of all lands. So that generation which came out of Egypt would not be allowed to enter the promised land. So they had to wander until they had all died out. And there were exceptions. The exceptions were all those who were under the age of 20, and the two men, Joshua and Caleb. They were the two spies who came back with a good report saying we could take the land. And the background here is Numbers chapter 14, verses 20 to 35, and Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 34 to 35. Now, the reasons for God's discipline of that generation which came out of Egypt is in verse 16. Because they rejected mine ordinances and walked not in my statutes, and profaned my Sabbaths, for their heart went after their idols. That is, what we see here is that they did not keep the law of Moses. They walked not in the ordinances, and they profaned my Sabbath. Both of these are all part of the law of Moses. And their root problem and the reason why they failed to keep the law and the Sabbath was because their heart went after their idols. Again, the point is that God did not carry out the full degree of judgment which they deserved. And so in verse 17, God did preserve the nation. Nevertheless, mine eye spared them, and I destroyed them not. Neither did I make a full end of them in the wilderness. Now we're going to see in verses 18 to 26, the rebellion of the second generation. Remember, in dealing with this review of Israel's history, we noted that Ezekiel makes the same basic points in each segment. First, we see God's provision. Then we see the rebellion of Israel. Third, divine judgment. Fourth, divine mercy. We're going to see it again here. In verses 18 to 26 was the rebellion of the second generation of Jews in the wilderness. In the previous section, he talked about the rebellion of the first generation who came out. They're the ones who actually came out of Egypt. Now he's dealing with the rebellion which occurred 40 years later. And I said unto their children in the wilderness, walk ye not in the statutes of your fathers, neither observe their ordinances, nor defile yourselves with their idols. I am Jehovah your God. Walk in my statutes and keep mine ordinances and do them, and hallow my Sabbaths. And they shall be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am Jehovah your God. So this is verses 18 to 20, showing God's provision. So in verse 18, where he says their children, he means the children of the previous generation of whom he spoke in verses 10 to 17. This is the generation that was born in the wilderness to those who came out of Egypt. In verses 18 to 20, he deals with God's provision, which comprised some specific admonitions here. In verse 18, we have some negative ones, that they must not do what their fathers had done when they came out of Egypt. What was their key problem? Their key problem was idolatry. Then in verses 19 to 20, we get the positive admonitions. Walk in my statutes, keep mine ordinances and do them. Hallow my Sabbaths. Do those, you'll live long and happy. Now, this was necessary because the Sabbath was a sign of the covenant. So if you hallow my Sabbath, you're keeping the covenants. They should do all of this for the purpose, in the end of verse 20, that they might know who is really their God. It is Jehovah God. Now, as was true in their previous national history, now in verse 21 came the rebellion. But the children rebelled against me. And the evidence of their rebellion is seen in that they did not follow the admonitions of verses 18, 19, and 20. They walked not in my statutes, neither kept mine ordinances to do them, which if a man do, he shall live in them. In fact, they did the exact opposite of what was commanded. What God said they were not to do, they did. And what he told them to do, they refused to do. They profaned my Sabbaths. And the historical background to this is Numbers 25, verses 1 to 9. And the problem, it's also recorded here in Psalm, poetically, it's recorded in Psalm 106, verses 28 to 33. Now, the third thing we now see the divine judgment at the end of verse 21. Then I said, I would pour out my wrath upon them to accomplish mine anger against them in the wilderness. Once again, God's judgment was now tempered by his mercy. Verses 22 to 26, Ezekiel deals at length with this mercy of God. Now, as before, God's mercy was exercised for the preservation of his name. Nevertheless, verse 22, nevertheless, I withdrew my hand and wrought for my name's sake, that it should not be profaned in the sight of the nations in whose sight I brought them forth. So for his name's sake, it says, I withdrew my hand, which means he didn't allow the judgments to be carried out to its full extent, because that would have meant the annihilation of the entire nation. His judgment did strike them and thousands died, but nationally Israel survived because God withdrew his hand of judgment. And again, it is emphasized that he did it for his own name's sake, so that what he had done would not be misinterpreted among the Gentile nations. Always divine mercy is divine discipline in verses 23 to 26. At that point in verse 23, God made a promise that there's going to be a future dispersion of the nation, a future worldwide scattering, because the problem of rebellion was so entrenched in them that it was clear that the cup of iniquity would eventually overflow. And at that point, there'd be no further remedy and a worldwide dispersion would occur. So, the second generation was clearly told about a worldwide dispersion. This is also something he put himself under oath to perform. Moreover, I swear unto them in the wilderness that I would scatter them among the nations and disperse them through the countries. Now, the place where we find God telling the second generation about this is Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy chapters 28 to 30. That's Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 28 to 30. They were indeed clearly told that dispersion among the nations would be their future lot. And this ultimately came as a result of the rejection of the prophet like unto Moses, Messiah Jesus. And again, this is also recorded in Psalm 106, verses 26 to 27. And in verse 24, we have the reasons. Because they had not executed mine ordinances, but had rejected my statutes and had profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were after their fathers' idols. So here in verse 24, the reason is given as violation of God's commandments in the Mosaic law. Instead, they followed in the idolatrous footsteps of their fathers. Now, the discipline went even further in verse 25. Moreover, also, I gave them statutes that were not good, and ordinances wherein they should not live. I gave them statutes that were not good. Well, they were not good in the sense that they brought about condemnation. And these were ordinances wherein they should not live. Why? Because they did not produce life. The point here is that God gave Israel over to perverse ways. He gave them over to following the statutes of the nations that were around them, which would bring about their own demise. And ultimately, they would see that only God's ways were good. This is a common principle of God's divine dealings. This principle is also found in Psalm 81, verse 12, and Isaiah 63, verse 17. We'll see God telling Ezekiel's generation to go and do the same thing when we come down to verse 29. Okay, finally in verse 26, we read of the result. And I polluted them in their own gifts, in that they caused to pass through the fire all that openeth the womb, that I might make them desolate to the end that they might know that I am Jehovah. They were polluted in their own gifts. Now, these gifts were the opposite statutes and ordinances of verse 25. God polluted them by letting them go their own way, following after the ordinances of the idolatrous nations. And one example of what happened when God said, let them go, was a practice of human sacrifice, in that they caused to pass through the fire all that openeth the womb. This was a perversion of Exodus 13:12 and a violation of Leviticus 18:21 and Deuteronomy 18:10. There was no human sacrifice in Israel's laws. Now, the result of permitting Israel to go their own way, leading to gross sins like human sacrifice, was so that in the end he might make them desolate. Now, ultimately, of course, so that they might know who God is, that they might know that I am Jehovah, and I'm the one you should be following. You should be following my laws and ordinances. And we see the rebellion in the land in verses 27 to 29. He now deals with what happened once Israel entered into the land, the promised land. Once again, we have another rebellion. Therefore, son of man, speak unto the house of Israel and say unto them, thus says the Lord Jehovah, in this, moreover, have your fathers blasphemed me, in that they have committed a trespass against me. For when I had brought them into the land which I swear to give unto them, then they saw every high hill and every thick tree, and they offered there their sacrifices, and there they presented the provocation of their offerings. There also they made their sweet savour, and they poured out their drink offerings. Then I said unto them, what meaneth the high place whereunto you go? So the name thereof is called Bama unto this day. So we see the guilt of the fathers in verse 27. Therefore, because of what happened in verses 5 to 26, the object that he's speaking to here is the house unto the house of Israel. He's speaking to them. The point here in this, moreover, have your fathers blasphemed me because of what they've done. And the sin is that they have committed a trespass against me. In verse 28, for when I brought them into the land which I swear to give unto them. Now, the guilt of the fathers from history past, even from Egypt and the wilderness, was the going up to every high hill to worship the gods of the peoples around them. They sacrificed to idols right down to Ezekiel's time. It says there they presented the provocation of their offering. What this says is that they purposely did this to provoke God. Sweet savor, what ought to have been a sweet savor actually became offensive by their corruptions. And in all the various kinds of offerings, in everything, they violated the Mosaic law. Result we see in verse 29. Then I said unto them, what meaneth the high place whereunto you go? So the name thereof is called Bama to this day. Now, what is the meaning of this name? For my altar is not so called. What excellence do you see in it that you go there? This is a bit of a paraphrase. Rather than to my temple, the only lawful place of sacrificing. The very name high place, right, convicts them of sinning, not from ignorance, but from perverse rebellion. There's a bit of a play upon words here in the Hebrew text. The question, what is this high place, is ma habama. So the name is called Bama, meaning what is this high place? It's called unto this day, whereas this name ought to have been long since dead or laid aside, along with the custom of sacrificing in high places, which it represents, being borrowed from the idolatrous nations around about them, who also called their places of sacrifices this Bama. But it was still going on. Now, lest they come out now with the same line which they gave in chapter 18, that this was only true of their fathers and not of them in Ezekiel's day. Chapters 30 to 32 deals with their rebellion, and it's time's up, so we will continue with this in the next session. We'll continue from verse 30 onwards. Okay, thank you for coming along. Study hard, grow strong. Thank you.